So, hello and welcome. My name is Mark Long. I'm a professor of political science at the College of Charleston, where I also serve as the faculty liaison and curator at large at the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art. And I'm here with Greg Miller to discuss a new book called Unto Dusk.
Great. And I'm Greg Miller, and here's the book. I'm a photographer, and I've been photographing for a long time, and this was one of my projects that I started over 20 years ago, and it's a series of photographs of on taken on Ash Wednesday, but only like one day a year over the course of 20 years. And so anyway, so I thought we could launch into it, and like let me know if I leave anything out.
Perfect, perfect. So, Greg, I thought we might get started just having me ask you about Unto Dust. So, how the project got started, I'm sure, is something people would be interested to hear about. And I know you have the ability to show some images. So, as you're maybe walking us through this, you might show us a picture, perhaps James from 1997, which I know
Yeah,
was one of the
yeah, we
one
could
of the
do
very
that.
early pictures in the series.
That's a good idea. Let me go there. And so it really started at a time when I was still I photograph. I could just say that I photograph with a sort of a unusual camera. It's an 8x10 camera, 8x10 referencing the negative size, and it's a view camera. I have to use it on tripod, and I at that time I had just started using it, and and so I was really regularly going out and photographing every day, whatever day I could get out, and really in an effort to teach myself how to use the camera. So yeah, so I would go out and I would photograph, and traditionally, like even before I started photographing with this camera, I've always considered myself a street photographer, and meaning that the street is where I find my creativity. It's where I find my subject matter, and and the thing I love about the street is that it's infinite. That it's always changing, and it's always new and always interesting. It seems anyway. So I went out this day, and it happened to be a Wednesday, and I went out and I saw that there were people walking around. Not everybody, but some people had ashes on their forehead, and I began wondering. I'm not Catholic, and I didn't, I grew up a Methodist. Like we didn't do that, and so I was curious, and so I asked this man. His name is James, and he was walking by, and he was the first person I photographed, and he was the one who explained to me what Ash Wednesday was, and or is. And so that's the really kind of like not very exciting story of how it began. But then when I took those pictures, and they were kind of cool. Like there was maybe three out of the whatever six that I took that that I was interested in, but I only had those three, and so that wasn't a project. And it wasn't until the next year that I realized that it could be a project, and I went out again. And then it's sort of, and I think it was even still, it was after the third year, I think, that I felt like maybe I have a project, and it's the slowest project ever, I should say.
Sure. And I think that's really one of the things that we'll probably come back to discuss maybe time and again here, Greg, is the fact that this is such a long standing project. I mean, it's quite remarkable to think you've been doing this for 25 years at this stage. And I know it's one day a year. So, in a certain sense, one could argue it's 25 days worth of work, right? But
Right.
it's a very, very fascinating project in part then because it runs so long. And I'm curious in that sense, are there moments, or maybe a better way to formulate the question would be, how does one stay with it, right? How do you keep going over the course of such a long time frame with a project such as this, especially when it's as piecemeal as it is? And I'm wondering about that, even from the point of view of were there moments when you wondered about the project in question, maybe what you were doing with Unto Dust?
Well, I think you know it being so long, and in some ways, I can't believe that I was available on those days, over the course of that many years, and then to I kept going, it would come up, and I would say like halfway through it, it became like my friends knew there it was happening, and my friends would say, "Oh, it's Ash Wednesday," and people would even, and once social media arrived, because this did start before social media. This started in 1997, so it was. My friends would be like, "Oh, happy Ash Wednesday," like it was like, kind of like my New Year or something, and that added a kind of an interesting layer to it that, like that, I kind of became known for it, and I think, and I would also say that, Ash Wednesday is the first day of Lent in the. If people don't know what Ash Wednesday is the first day of Lent in the Christian liturgical calendar, and so it's actually a somber day. It's not a day where, like you're like happy Ash Wednesday or anything. You're not going to say that to somebody. It's a day of, where you begin repentance. So you kind of touch in with your mortality, and the ashes signify, that you're going to return to ashes, so it's this, this whole idea. So that was, but I loved the fact that people said happy Ash Wednesday to me. Like, I loved that there was a celebratory mood. And in fact, when I was photographing people that really had received their ashes and they'd gone to mass and they'd had the whole thing, and they themselves, in being photographed on that day, it also took on this sort of celebratory aspect. And I think that's kind of interesting. Like, so, I mean, so on one hand, I don't want to sound like I'm belittling it by saying happy Ash Wednesday, but it was like that. I loved that confluence of those two things like that.
Okay, so so I think in part then it sounds as though maybe you're drawing energy from the project in that way, right? So there's a celebratory tone, as you say, and I'm sure the encounters with people likewise. I wonder if you could pop up Ilona's image in particular as we're talking here, Greg, just from the point of view of somebody who maybe was particularly important in terms of pushing the whole project forward, and maybe again, I'm just fascinated at the idea that you're available for sure, but also your enthusiasm, it seems, didn't wane over the course of this long time frame.
Well, I would say it did. I mean, it's so long that, there is a point at, like, I mean, I don't know, maybe the 10-year mark where I was like, what am I doing? Like, what is this? Like, is this a book? Like, anyway, but no, so I met Ilona in 2009 when she was walking from St. Patrick's Cathedral. And actually, I'll mention that. So when I do this, like, if you on Ash Wednesday, like if you're in New York, like Channel 7 will park their van like right on the corner of like where St. Patrick's Cathedral is, and they'll just like interview people or whatever, or do their report from there. And so I always thought that was cheating. You know what I mean? I thought, like if you're a photographer, if you're a street photographer, you can't just like park in one place. I mean, I've never done that. Even with a heavy camera, I feel like I need to walk around. And so and also I don't want the background to be the same, so I felt like, this need to walk around. But even still, I was in that area of Midtown. And so Ilona was walking from St. Patrick's Cathedral, and this is about 50th Street, something like that. And I saw her, and she has a huge ash on her forehead. Like, so sometimes, the priest would just do just tiny things. Like, it just depends. But sometimes some years were really great,
sure.
So Ilona had this big ash, and she was also, I think, amazing. Like, she was extraordinary. And walking past me, and I said, "Excuse me, can I photograph you?" And I would give her my same spiel, and she thought about it, and she said, "Yes, of course." And then, and so I set up the camera, and I was doing I was focusing on her, and I said, and I will give people instructions like look in the camera or like look past the camera, something like that, some simple thing, but it kind of like very, in a way, like very sparse instructions, because I want them to do things that I haven't expected. I want the unexpected. And so she looked past the camera and she said, "Okay, I'll look at the Lord." And she like looked up in the sky, and a big smile came over her face. And she was so like gone that I wanted to do a double take over my shoulder. Like, what is she looking at? And so this was like really an amazing surprise. And then I photographed it. And this is like not something, so, when I photograph with an 8x10 camera, there's a lot of direction, there's a lot of me, I don't know how to say it. Like I have to kind of focus. Like there's a lot of standing around. Like I focus on them. So it's very, very deliberate. And, but then there's still surprises. There's still this moment, so it's like a moment within a moment. And like walking away from that, I wasn't sure if maybe I was like, is she crazy? Like, is she like gone? Like maybe I'm taking advantage of her somehow or something. But then I thought about it a little longer, and I thought, that is kind of the way you're supposed to react if you really believe God is there. And I thought, maybe I'm crazy, like maybe the rest of us are crazy. When I was growing up and I was in a Methodist church, like I grew up Methodist, and there used to be a reading in church. I mean, I think this is like true of, I don't know, every church,
Sure.
but like you do this reading and everybody reads in this monotone way. And it's like, you hear everybody and it echoes off the walls. And sometimes you're like, rejoice, he is risen, or whatever, like, and it's like,
Sure.
and everybody's reading in this way. I'm like, guys, if you really believe that, like you would be reading a different way. Like, and so I feel like there's this assumption that this is never going to bubble up over, just us like going to work and, like, and so for me, like Alona represented this idea of like what it would look like if we really believed. And so like that, in that sense, like this was kind of a turning point for me, because for me, I didn't grow up Catholic. I mean, I did grow up with some amount of religion around me, but I think more than anything, I remember the people around me questioning their faith and struggling with it. And so this idea of, not being holy enough resonates with me. And so to meet Alona and have this experience was really significant.
Okay, that's really fascinating, Greg. In part because, of course, she's such a contrast with many of the other portraits in the series, precisely because of that faith, I guess, that's inscribed into her persona, right? So, I mean, in that sense, if you can't find, I guess, if you can't conjure your God on a day like Ash Wednesday, then when can one? I guess, right, becomes the question in part. So moving along a little bit to think about the process of being out there. I mean the way in which the project functions, and thinking about the idea that this is something that happens once a year, right? That is a special day for Catholics, and increasingly it seems maybe for people in other faiths, likewise Episcopalians, for example, I understand are increasingly engaging in this rite, right? I think one of the really fascinating things about the project is that ritualistic dimension. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your own ritual, right? I mean, it's very much a ritual for you in terms of getting out there on a given day, on an annual basis. But also one of the things that I find really compelling here is this logic of this being a practice that's rooted in long-standing traditions, right? So this is the old world, if one wants to think about it as such, come to life on the streets of New York City, on Ash Wednesday, once a year, right? And that idea of it being a ritual is certainly something that I'd like for you to touch on, as I say, both for your own purposes with your own ritual, and then maybe that broader picture of just how old the practice here is.
The thing that immediately fascinated me about this was that these people were walking around New York City, they're hailing cabs, they're like, going to work. And there's very much this contemporary society going around, but meanwhile they have ashes on their forehead. Like it's an ashen cross on their forehead. So it predates Christianity. It's just old, very old. The thing that attracted me to New York City was this kind of juxtaposition of the old and new. Like there's just the old New York and there's the new New York. And if you, and this is just fascinates me everywhere. But then it evolved, like, in working with this camera, and over time, like I myself was I was using this old camera, and I'm sort of digitizing it or whatever. I mean, I wasn't digitizing it then, but I'm like doing a modern thing with this old thing. And then I'm also, this process of it being cyclical, of it returning every year, and not doing it at all, like for a year. Like, so that means I didn't photograph Ash Wednesday. Of course, I was photographing all year long, doing other things, but I kind of returned, like I stopped photographing this way. Like if you know my other work, like over the years, I kind of backed off, and I love this narrative where, I'm photographing people and you really feel like you're like, do they know I'm here? Like they're really over there. And so this idea of doing portraits, where they're centered and they're engaging the camera. There's like this testimonial going on. Like, to me, that was a departure, so I would return to that every year.
I didn't realize that we could kind of editorialize here some, but I think showing some of the other work would be really a great idea from the point of view, not so much of promoting Greg Miller, but just the foil, right? That, an image, and we, how enthusiastic I am about the Nashville work.
Yeah.
And if I am, it's precisely because of the narrative potential in every one of those photographs, right? I mean, you could spin a novel around, the folks standing in the river, or the old lady looking through the shoe repair window, right? Whereas, these are really different. So,
my grandfather was a Methodist minister.
Sure.
And so when I took this photograph, I was driving by when the minister was already gone. Like I had to kind of tell him, look, I want to make this photograph, and I explained to him. And while he was standing there in the middle of the parking lot, the sun came out in this way. And so I feel like there was, and to me, I was looking when I was doing Nashville, just not to get off on that, but like, I was looking for reasons for doing it. Like, why am I doing this? Because I don't, I can't stress enough, like that, it looks like when somebody has a buttoned up project, when it's on the wall in a museum, or when it's in a book, it looks like what you're doing. But like in the course of it, and getting back to the, this project, like 10 years in, I didn't know like if it was the right thing to do, and but it's things like, it was this woman's, like, she's holding her earphones like a rosary,
Okay, that one didn't make it into oh, that's her. Okay, damn, I didn't notice the detail. Sure.
Yeah, so to me, like that's kind of an amazing, so those are those surprises. That's like the sun coming out, and when a minister's standing there, that's absolutely like Ilona looking at God, like, so, but you go day in and day out feeling like you're not doing anything, like you don't know. These are the moments when the project tells you you're doing it.
So again, then, one of the things that makes this such a compelling project, Greg, is this juxtaposition of old and new. And obviously, this is a really wonderful image that captures that. The headphones here wrapped around this young woman's hand as though it's a rosary bead speaks to that logic. And scholars talk about the idea of senses of time that are anchored in the logic of the calendar, cyclical, coming around again. And so the commemoration that Ash Wednesday entails is self-evidently part and parcel of that way of thinking about time and our existence. But of course, that contrasts very deliberately with another way in which people think about time, which is a scheduled based logic, right? Which is to say that instead of looking backwards and commemorating, that time is always looking forward. It's always about efficiency, and the kind of maybe the best way to think about that in American context is this logic of quality time, right? The idea that we can parcel out our time and really get what needs from it by calling it something that perhaps it's not. And the reason that's as interesting as it is to me in no small measure is because you're on the streets of New York City. And New York City, of course, is the epitome of the modern world. It's in many senses the most modern city anywhere over the course, certainly the second half of the 20th century and on through to today. And so can you talk a little bit about New York as a backdrop for this project then, especially from this perspective of old and new, modern and traditional contemporary and older ways of being in the world, because that's really in an important way then what we're seeing here. And at some point it would be really great too to see those images of shoppers, right? I mean, I think about the deity that is the Catholic God, as it were.
Well, I was going to say that it's in the background, but it's also, I mean, you have like the parked cars and you have occasional taxis and you have the buildings, which are, by the way, out of focus because of the shallow depth of field of my camera.
Sure.
And then, but also there's the way the people are dressed, you know, and that's like another part of the modern world. Like we have plastic clothes, you know, we have like jackets that are, you know, so to me, you know, that this idea of like, you know, the modern world, but also kind of fashion in a way, like so there is this element of, I mean, and I think New York, the other thing about New York is that it's a center for commerce, you know, so you have like, you know, people shopping and I mean, and if they're not shopping, they're working. And another thing I wanted to point out actually in this, I mean, I don't know if this is relevant at this moment, but there's this, that everywhere, you know, other places that you know, Lent is observed, there's a party, like there's Carnival, you know, and or Fat Tuesday or whatever. In New Orleans, there's, you know, and but there's no party in New York. You know what I mean? Like maybe in a bar somewhere on Tuesday, you know, before Ash Wednesday, there's, you know, people partying or whatever, but there's no real, like New Yorkers don't do that. Like, it's just New Yorkers go straight for repentance. You know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like there's this work ethic.
One dimension to the answer to that conundrum, as it were, about, you know, why is it not like Rio, is probably because of the Irish Catholics in New York, right? So I remember as a kid growing up feeling really shortchanged when I learned about Carnival, because what happens in Ireland is something called Shrove Tuesday that you may or may not be familiar with. But basically you eat crepes, and the reason you eat crepes is because you want to be done with the eggs, because eggs would have typically been something that was frowned upon over the course of the Lenten sacrifice, right? So I'll bet you're right about the people in the bars getting hammered, but a lot of them are people that are probably giving up alcohol for the 40 days. So they're, you know, one last hurrah, and then tomorrow morning is Lent. And so it's all about the sacrifice and the penance.
Since you're Irish, is there a story, you know, or what is your early experience with Ash Wednesday?
You know, listen, I think it's probably more than anything else a very banal event, which is paradoxical because it's such a signature thing that happens once a year. But precisely when you're in a world where everybody is doing the same thing, right? And of course, Ireland was a very hyper-Catholic place in the 1970s and 1980s when I would have been, getting the ash put on my forehead. But everybody was doing it. So it was utterly lost then in just the kind of everyday, banal, everybody's doing the same thing on this particular day. I think if anything else, what was remarkable was probably the fact that it coincided with Lent, right? So, kind of kids gearing up for Lent in terms of making decisions about, I'm putting my candy away. And, in a really interesting way too, Greg, to think about that as a penance, what happened was kids would box up their candy over the course of the entirety of Lent. And so then here would come Easter Sunday and you'd not only have Easter eggs, but you'd have a box of Mars bars and Smarties and kids would get sick as a dog, right? So, so I think, an important way is there's a lot more to be said for thinking about Lent in a place like New York City, for example, where not everybody is observing the religious rite, right, and the holiday. And so everybody is out, or everybody who's Catholic and I guess, practicing Catholic is making the effort to have the ash put on their forehead. But I would say that was certainly not the case when I grew up in Ireland. I'd be curious to go back now on an Ash Wednesday and see, who's doing it. I know my parents are for sure, right? But I would think probably people of my generation and younger folks would really be kind of signaling to themselves and to the world who they are in the same way that people in your pictures here are doing. So, Greg, thanks for walking us through this fascinating project and the book that results from it. One of the really wonderful things about what I've learned in the conversation is the fact that, you're continuing to make the work. I know you were out over the course of the last couple of weeks here as kind of spring rolls around. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what, the next chapter will bring, right? More photographs in New York, perhaps, but certainly the prospect of you in New Orleans making pictures and maybe in Belfast or Jerusalem or wherever it would be around the world is very tantalizing, to say the least.
I'm making the list right now. And Mark, thank you so much. This has been great. I really, really appreciate it. I'm so grateful.